are going to discuss Jupiter in Scorpio. But in order to be able to discuss Jupiter in Scorpio well, the first thing we're going to do is discuss Jupiter and then Scorpio. Then we can have an easy, intelligent conversation about what Jupiter signifies in Scorpio. And then we can look at actual people who have it, so we can put a face on Jupiter and Scorpio. And finally, we could look in detail at two of the birth charts of two of the kind of extremes, archetypical and antithetical Jupiter and Scorpios. So let's get into that right away. Before starting, I want to remind you, let you know, if you're interested in Jupiter and Scorpio or whatever you may have in your chart, if you want to get my interpretation of the planets in the signs, houses, etc. that you have, you can get this report. And that's available at that URL. All right, Jupiter represents positivity. That's why Jupiter represents things increasing, growing, and hence it's associated with success or profit. Because it's all about growing or increasing, it's all about creation, because you have to produce things to proliferate and make things grow. So Jupiter is about creation, and because it's about creation and production, it's about reproduction or parenting. So Jupiter is the planet for moms and dads and people who make babies. And also, it's not just the biological version of that. It's the abstracted version of that, which means everybody who plays a parental role in society. And that's why Jupiter represents the parental figures like your teachers, like the priests, like the gurus, like the guides. And also because Jupiter is creative and productive and has surplus. Therefore, it's a planet which signifies the surplus attitude, which is the attitude of generosity and giving. Now, if we go back to the root of what Jupiter signifies, which is positivity, another branch of symbolism for Jupiter is that it's very optimistic, positive person. Positivity means you trust that things will be okay. Because Jupiter is the planet of optimism, that's why it has to do with the things that we trust in, the things that we believe in, the faith that we have. And this is why it has to do with morality. And that's why it has to do with religion. So that's everything important about Jupiter. Now let's do a similar analysis for Scorpio. Fundamentally, Scorpio is the sign for passion. The way you construct Scorpio, the ingredients in the recipe list is you take Mars and you put it in an area of the zodiac which is watery and fixed or deep. So Mars gives tons of fire and energy and testosterone, and water gives a lot of feeling and depth and emotion. So the result is that Scorpio is a place which is associated with passion. And so let's talk about three implications of the word passion. The first is kind of probably the most obvious one, which means sexuality. Scorpio is classically the sexy sign. It's a sexual sign, and therefore it also has a kind of a charisma or attractiveness to it. Another implication of passion means intensity, like how into something you are. And Scorpio is a sign for significant intensity or strength or force in which you do something. And therefore, another way of saying intensity means depth, how deep you are into something. So Scorpio is a very deep sign because it's a very intense sign. But making it a deep sign and watery makes it get into things which are hidden or secret or mystery. It goes deep into things. So one of the key factors, one of the key things about Scorpio is that it's deep. It's into things which are internal, hidden, underground, secret, mysterious, occult, etc. Psychological. And finally, the third implication of Scorpio, of passion, is passion means I want. So in passion, the I becomes the focus, and this is how passion is different or differentiable from love. In love, the loved person is the focus, but in passion, I am the focus. So because Scorpio is very passionate, it also signifies individualism and individuality. And the concomitant factor of individualism is independence. You stand on your own 2 feet. And a byproduct of this is that Scorpio is quite defiant. It doesn't need to go along with the group. It's perfectly fine doing its own thing. So it's very defiant, and that can be also expressed as unique, individualistic in that sense, or rebellious. Now we know what we need to know about Jupiter and Scorpio, and we can talk and know what we're talking about when we discuss how to interpret Jupiter being in Scorpio. So what you do, in any case, whenever you want to know the implications of any planet in any sign, you consider, what does this planet have in common with this sign? Some of the things that they have in common will be things that they have opposite views on. And some of the things that they have in common, they have complementary views on. When the planet and the sign have complementary views, then it indicates good things. And when they have conflicting views, it indicates conflicts or difficult outcomes. In this case with Jupiter and Scorpio, it's half and half. So for example, we learn that Jupiter is the planet of optimism, trust, right? Trust. And Scorpio is not a trusting sign. Scorpio is a defiant sign. So they're talking about the same thing, which is whether or not you believe or question, whether or not you follow or refuse to follow. But they're talking about this topic in different ways. Scorpio has the opinion that it's good to disbelieve, and Jupiter has the opinion that it's good to believe. So here's an example of the clash between the planet and the sign. The clash of Jupiter's trust with Scorpio's defiance. How you interpret that. It means that the person's philosophy or their approach to life is individualistic. They themselves determine their opinions and their values. They do not want to be packaged or dogmatized. So this will also imply that they tend to be self-educating or self-informing, not very easy to educate. And they'll tend to be heterodoxical, which means they won't go along with the homogeneous opinion. They often will not go along with the homogeneous opinion about things. They want to have their own opinions about things. So they tend to develop philosophies which are defiant of norms. The next major thing about Jupiter and Scorpio is that Jupiter is the planet of honesty. It's all about morality and trustability, right? So it's the planet of honesty. Scorpio has to do with secrecy, things that are hidden, things that are deep and you can't see on the surface. So you have another clash. Jupiter's honesty, Scorpio's secrecy. So how do you interpret this? The person is distrusting. They're skeptical. They do a lot of questioning. Often the person will become kind of obsessed with discovering fictions, discovering lies, discovering the unknown. They'll become also perhaps obsessed with dealing with deceptions, dealing with the unknown and hidden things. So they can become involved in trickery. They can become involved in dishonesty. Now, the two remaining things about Jupiter and Scorpio, however, are complementary, and so they have positive outcomes. So the first thing is Jupiter is the planet for religion and what you believe in. Scorpio is pretty okay with that because it's about things which are unseen. So it's about mystical things, things you can't exactly see, but you sort of feel and intuit. So it goes well together to have the planet of religion and belief in the sign of intuition and mysticism. The result here is that people with Jupiter and Scorpio, they tend to actually care about mystical things, intuitions, psychologies, philosophical things. So, although they have individualistic and heterodoxical philosophies, they are into philosophies. And finally, Jupiter is the planet for making babies. It's the planet of parenting and reproduction. That goes along really great with Scorpio, which is the planet for sexuality. So Jupiter and Scorpio people are expected to be sexy, attractive, and sexually active. Also, if you think about what sexuality is, it's creation. So people with Jupiter and Scorpio, they have a lot of creative energy. So they tend to be creative, or talented, or artistic. Now, let's try to put a face on Jupiter and Scorpio, or many dozens of faces, by looking at the names of important or well-known people who have Jupiter and Scorpio. So first, let me present you with a group of philosophers. It's very easy to find significant philosophers who have Jupiter and Scorpio, and their philosophies tend to be quite similar. With the exception of the first one that I will mention, who's the Dalai Lama. It's a bit different from the rest of them. In addition to Dalai Lama, you have Aleister Crowley, Deepak Chopra, Michael Onfray, who's a big atheistic philosopher, L. Ron Hubbard, culty, Uri Geller, culty mystic, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a science philosopher, cosmologist, and his predecessor, Carl Sagan. So Dalai Lama is pretty interesting, and we're going to want to look at his chart in more detail. The rest of them, you can see how they're kind of dealing with mystery, heterodox to the norm of philosophy, which tends to be theistic, but kind of obsessed with religious themes, but not going along with religion dogma. The next group of people, and also not too difficult to find plenty of with Jupiter and Scorpio, are criminals or cultists. Kind of L. Ron Hubbard is bridging the gap, but then you also have really hardcore criminal cultists like Charles Manson, David Koresh, Ted Bundy, Al Capone, O.J. Simpson, just more like a regular criminal, and then Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Nazi Germany. So there you go. This is really highlighting that clash between Jupiter being honesty and Scorpio being secrecy. So you can get people that are not really trustworthy. Yet they're going to be really interested in philosophy and spirituality. Another interesting thing with Jupiter and Scorpio is that a lot of very significant writers turn up. So here's some of the names that I found. Stephen King, Alfred Hitchcock, Steven Spielberg, Stan Lee, Ernest Hemingway, Jules Verne, Leo Tolstoy, Kurt Vonnegut. So they have a common theme. They're either dealing with horror or space or something like that. Maybe Ernest Hemingway is a bit different. So it's going along with the nature of Jupiter and Scorpio. Why would writers be Jupiter and Scorpio? It's probably not the case that Jupiter and Scorpio is the dominant factor in their charts. But Jupiter and Scorpio is probably supporting something dominant, which is more clearly indicating authorship. But the reason why Jupiter and Scorpio can support that is because Jupiter is very wordy. Because Jupiter has to do with sound. This is one thing that's not on the list of Jupiter, but sound is the agent for expansion of the universe, according to the mystical cosmologies. Sound is the agent by which space turns into air, and then air turns into fire, etc. So the agent for the unfolding and expansion of the universe is sound, and since Jupiter represents the positivity and the growth, it also represents sound. Sound means words. So Jupiter is very good with sound and words. Hence, Jupiter in a sign where you get a lot of creativity, like Scorpio, they can be good with sound and with words. Another group of people that are interesting to mention are sex symbols. Mata Hari, who may be not particularly famous anymore, but is one of the original sex symbols, who's also involved with espionage and spying. Candy Barb, one of the original famous strippers. Betty Page, and Savannah, a more modern adult porno actress. So that goes right along with Jupiter is the planet of reproduction. Scorpio is the planet of sexuality. Scorpio is the sign for sexuality, so the sexual activity is very likely when Jupiter's in Scorpio. Finally, musicians always turn up whenever you look for any planet in any sign because there's so many musicians and also so many actors. But sometimes you find very significant musicians, and that's when it's good to look at that. In this case, we have quite a few significant musicians, and what they have in common is quite interesting. Elvis Presley, David Bowie, Morrissey, Joan Jett, Patti Smith, Iggy Pop. There's a lot in common there. They're all very punky and defiant and sexy. And then you have really great singers, Pavarotti and Bocelli. This is with Jupiter being the planet of sound. And then you have Tchaikovsky, who's a very great composer. So again, that's with Jupiter being the planet of sound. So that's very interesting to see how these names give a face to these principles about Jupiter and Scorpio. As you can see, not everybody is exactly the same. So what I like to do is pick out somebody who's more or less stereotypically extreme of what is expected from the planet, and pick out somebody who's more or less not conforming with that stereotypical extreme, and have a look at the charts of those two to see what makes them different. So in this case, I would either pick Charles Manson or David Koresh as the stereotypical extreme for Jupiter and Scorpio. I don't mean to say that if you have Jupiter and Scorpio, you probably are the next Charles Manson and David Koresh. I don't mean to say that. But I mean to say the stereotypical extreme of Jupiter and Scorpio. And I want to look at their charts to see how they were brought to bring out that stereotypical extreme. What astrological factors brought that out? The reason why I say that there's a stereotypical extreme is because this defiance and this secrecy, which clashes with Jupiter, is really exemplified in them, as well as the traits of being very interested in religion/philosophy and being very involved with sex. The one who's not like this is Dalai Lama. He doesn't seem to be particularly associated with sex, and also he's very orthodox. He's very orthodox. He's the leader of an orthodox religion. So let's take a look at that. So here is Charles Manson in his glorious, famous photograph with his chart. And here is the Dalai Lama with his chart. As far as the birth times go, Charles Manson's birth time is reliable, but Dalai Lama's is approximated. I mean, it's not a wild approximation. It's from an estimate. So we want to look at these two charts to see what makes them quite different. Let's look at Manson. Manson has Jupiter and Scorpio, and so do all the rest of the people on the list. But Manson is kind of unique. Why? Well, one of the things is his Scorpio is really pretty dominant. It's not just Jupiter, which is in Scorpio. He has a lot of planets in Scorpio. He has Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Sun in Scorpio, as you can see. So, and that's one of those planets, Venus, is his first lord, and it's conjoined with his Jupiter. So his Jupiter in Scorpio is pretty dominant in his chart. So the things that are associated with Jupiter and Scorpio are easier to actually come to pass in the individual. However, it's not even the most dominant planet in the chart. It's subservient to something else in his chart. So it's acting as the modifier of something else. The most dominant thing in his chart is his moon. This is because the moon is sitting on the cusp of the 10th house. And that moon is exactly conjoined to Rahu, which is basically like looking into the face of Charles Manson. You'll see what a moon-Rahu exact conjunction on the 10th house cusp dominating a chart would look like, especially considering that it's in Aquarius with Saturn. So when you think about Charles Manson, the first thing or the backbone of describing his personality is this really unstable, weird, socially strange mind represented by Jupiter exactly joined Rahu in Aquarius, dominating the chart. The next thing about him is, how was he weird and socially strange? He was in a very culty, creative, sexy way. And that is because the Jupiter in Scorpio and the rest of the activity in Scorpio is playing second fiddle to this moon. Now let's take a look at the Dalai Lama. Probably vastly dominating this chart is domicile Mercury in Gemini. Probably right on the ascendant. And I mean, that explains why he's not sexually active, even though Jupiter in Scorpio has the potential to make a person sexually active. If Mercury is dominating the ascendant, Mercury is prepubescent. So that will countermand any of the indications of Jupiter. Not only is the mercurial influence in his chart dependent on Mercury in Gemini being on the ascendant, because we're not totally sure of the birth time, but also his moon is quite dominant, and it's in Virgo, which is also mercurial and Virgin, and it's being aspected very strongly by Saturn, and that is one of the most significant factors which prevents him from being outright rebellious or heterodoxical, because Saturn will put a lot of influence of things which are lasting a long time. So when Saturn influences the moon, there'll be a lot of respect for things that have stood the test of time. So you won't really throw out traditional things. But the Dalai Lama is not really doing things the same way that his predecessors did. He's got a very modern, updated version to it. And that is what his Jupiter in Scorpio is able to produce in the context of a mercurially dominated chart, with the moon being influenced by the traditionalist Saturn. I want to thank you very much for watching this video all the way to this point. And I'll end by just reminding you about this report, which you can get so we can talk about your planets in your signs and your houses, etc. You go to my website, victorcara.com, go over to the readings, find the one called Guided Tour of Your Birth Chart, and then you can order that report. Thank you. I will see you next time, assuming that you subscribe and click the notifications button. Thanks.